What's up, everybody? Dave Blunt's 2004 back with another video today. Uh, Substantially upgraded my mic quality. I'm pretty excited about that. But there's something I wanted to talk about today, and maybe this is just nostalgia talking, but I genuinely think that old MMORPGs felt more alive than modern online games. And honestly, I think the internet felt more alive too. Back in 2004, 2003, RuneScape Classic, RuneScape 2 days, uh, getting online felt different and, and not necessarily better in every way, not more convenient, definitely not faster, but it felt mysterious. You know, Logging into a game like RuneScape in the early 2000s was truthfully just another world. The possibilities felt endless. And I think that's a lot harder to find these days. And that's what's, made me struggle with playing stuff like old school RuneScape as much and has really brought me so much joy when I discovered 2004, last year and started playing it during the beta. There's something strange about walking through these old 2004 RuneScape 2 environments again. The music, the empty spaces, the awkward interfaces, the long walks between cities. It really just reminds me of a version of the internet that just barely exists anymore. Back then everything felt so unexplored. And I don't just mean technically unexplored, I mean like socially unexplored. This was before social networks and, you know, social media. It was even before MySpace when RuneScape was first starting to get its legs. People were just existing online. Nobody really knew what online life was going to become yet, just experimenting. And because of that, everything felt more human. I think that's why old games, old MMOs like RuneScape 2, specifically in like 2004 to 2006, 2007, hit so much different because they were built during a time when the internet still felt wild. Back then, there wasn't one central internet culture that is so algorithmically controlled like there is today. I really feel like today everybody's told how to think, what to think, and, the algorithm pushes people towards different emotions. But at the end of the day, it usually seems like it ends up pushing people back to the same thing and the same feelings. You know, it was just so different. There wasn't just one group of thinking. Everybody existed in so many scattered little communities. I can remember playing in 2004. You had gaming forums, ran by different people. My clan website, we had a forum. Uh, just random RuneScape fan pages. As far as gaming and stuff online went, you had Flash games, you had Shockwave games, just half broken, game guides that were written by other kids and teenagers and, a few adults here and there. But everything just felt so much more homemade. It was really, truly different. And a lot of it back then looked terrible, but that was part of the charm. You would find just a random website with, black backgrounds, neon text, crude HTML explaining how to kill something like hill giants and make money by selling big bones. And you would find quest guides that were just so obtuse compared to what we have these days. and somehow it still felt magical because it felt like somebody made it purely because they cared about the game. They weren't trying to optimize anything like search engine algorithms, optimization, anything like that. They weren't trying to make money. They weren't trying to build a brand. They weren't chasing engagement metrics. Everything just felt so personal back when I started my experience with, the online world and RuneScape 2 back in the day. And even RuneScape Classic. I mean, I technically played 2001, but I didn't play it as much. Uh, you know, Everything just felt personal. MMOs like RuneScape reflected that exact energy. It felt less like a product when RuneScape launched and more like a place. And that's really the biggest difference, I think. Modern online games are increasingly designed to reduce friction. Everything is streamlined. MMOs have fast travel methods. You know, you can be anywhere in seconds, in old school RuneScape. Fast travel was definitely one of the big things I've noticed with the streamlining of modern stuff. Instant matchmaking where you can find a game for any mini game. You just go to the world that they designate on old school RuneScape. Back in the day on RuneScape 2, you had to find a world that was populated. Usually people would go to World 2. But, as time went on and there was more mini games, you weren't guaranteed to find a place that had instant matches. You would have to, do your research and find out where these games were being played the most, which server, stuff like that. You know, Optimized progression, everything in today's day and age is just streamlined. And technically, it is a good design. But old MMORPGs, I feel like, accidentally created something valuable through inconvenience. You know, Downtime. Nobody in old school RuneScape 2, they don't have downtime anymore. They know what to do, they know what the next step is. That downtime created social interaction that we just don't see anymore. Even in like Lost City here, you know, downtime is something that rarely exists for people that are focused on their next goal. When you had to walk across half the map to get somewhere and you didn't know where you were going, people would talk. When training a skill took, 6 straight hours, people talked. I can remember sitting at Catherby or, different spots, Barbarian Village, just fishing for an entire evening. Everybody talked. A lot of old MMO interaction existed because everybody was bored together. And boredom is weirdly important socially, I think. Modern games are just terrified of boredom. Every second has to be stimulating. But boredom is where the conversation happens. It's, where I made friendships in RuneScape. It's where weird moments, people getting destroyed by a random event, losing a party hat, just you would never know what would happen. I still remember conversations to this day from old, RuneScape nights in 2004, 2005 than I remember actual gameplay mechanics. I remember standing at banks just talking nonsense with people for, months, for hours. I would never get anything done in RuneScape back in the day. And I remember asking people dumb questions because there always wasn't a guaranteed answer available at your fingertips like there is in today's gaming, RuneScape included. And I remember people making up fake information all the time. That sounds bad now to people, but honestly, it made everything feel so much bigger. Back then, when the internet was relatively new, information spread a lot slower. Everybody had a rumor about everything. I can remember going to school, when we all discovered RuneScape. We would just sit around the lunch table and everybody had some completely fake thing to say about RuneScape. I could remember people being like, if you click such and such at midnight, this would happen. My cousin found a party hat from a goblin. Just weird stuff. There's a secret city under Falador. And because, that information wasn't instantly verified, everybody believed it. You've heard of the Pokemon, Mew under the truck. That's very much where that stemmed from. The internet had mystery. I feel like modern internet culture just kills mystery immediately and hates it. Everything gets solved now. Games are data mined before they even release. Entire wiki pages appear on day one. People have their meta builds, like for Leagues, with instance, when it launched recently on old school RuneScape. They had it solved, 48 hours before it even launched. YouTube thumbnails back in 2005, 2006 were nothing like they are now. Nowadays, YouTube thumbnails just are screaming at you, the best method, after just a few minutes of any game coming out. And I get why this happened. People naturally optimize things, but I really do feel like optimization changes how the worlds feel in the games. Old online games felt like forests. These modern online games, the way people treat them is more like spreadsheets. Everything's measured now. Everybody calculates everything. Efficiency became the dominant way that people interact with games, even socially. Nobody, communicates unless there's an end goal to it in old school RuneScape or RuneScape 3. Nobody just hangs out. Yes, there's a few people that bank stand, and the free to play worlds is a good example of some of the old school socializing, but it's rare. You know, I feel like social media really helped create that mindset too. The old internet was way slower, and because it was slower, everybody experienced things differently. You'd hear about websites from friends. You'd stumble into weird corners of the internet accidentally. I can remember spending hours customizing my MySpace profile for absolutely no reason. Everything just felt so much less centralized. There was just so much personality to it. And now everybody has the exact same cookie cutter experience on a handful of giant platforms every single day. Everybody is funneled into an algorithm. And algorithms are great at giving you what you already want, but they're just awful at creating mystery. Mystery requires unpredictability, I would say. Old internet culture, as I remember it, I could be looking through nostalgia glasses. It was unpredictable. Every day I would log into RuneScape, I would meet somebody from somewhere else, different countries, different states, for the first time in my life. I would discover music from somebody's random forum signature or their MySpace song. I'd find random animations and cartoons that were done in Flash on just strange websites that nobody had ever heard of. But you found them because there wasn't an algorithm pushing you where to go. You join weird clans with crazy politics in the game. They'd set up their own lore. They do all kinds of crazy stuff. Every online space felt local back then. And playing 2004 Scape has made me realize, that's another thing that just disappeared. Servers used to have identities. Even individual RuneScape worlds, everybody was different. You know, you would recognize, usernames. Communities had reputations, and you saw the same players over and over again. And there was accountability in that, you know, familiarity as well. Now everything, every online space just feels temporary and disposable. You join a world of pest control in a match with strangers that you'll never see again in old school RuneScape. You know, nobody talks. They're just focusing on getting their armor and they leave. The experience in modern RuneScape and MMOs in general, everything just feels transactional to me. You know, I don't even blame players for that. Games evolved, and it was inevitable to happen, I guess, around convenience. And, but convenience changes behavior. Old MMOs demanded patience. Today's modern games, from my observations, demand engagement. They're trying to keep you stimulated. And there's a big difference there. A lot of old game design, encouraged, be it accidental or not, lingering. Modern game design encourages retention loops. And weirdly, the older systems felt more relaxing despite being grindier because nobody expected maximum efficiency all the time. You could just exist in the world. And that's what I think people are actually nostalgic for. When they talk about how RuneScape was better in 2004, I don't think it's necessarily the mechanics of old school 2004, versus each other. It's definitely not the graphics. Everybody loves RuneLite with GPU rendering and stuff like that. It's the feeling of existing online before everything become optimized. Before every interaction became content, before hobby, you know, every single hobby you can think of became monetized. The early internet, as I remember it, was just, it felt so amateur in the best possible way. People created things because they were excited and they were passionate about something or they wanted to do something. And that's how RuneScape got its start. You know, if you look up the history of Andrew Gower, he would just make games because he didn't want to pay or he couldn't afford, games that were popular. So he would just make his own. And, you could feel that excitement everywhere online back in the day in the same fashion. The messy fan sites, the terrible cartoons, the microphone quality. God, if y'all thought my microphone quality from yesterday's video was bad, you should have been there back then. 2004 was just wild. We had no good microphones. Just the random weird forum drama with my clans I can remember, and I'm sure everybody that played back then had at least one interaction with that. It just all felt so alive. Everything now, to me, just feels so polished, so corporate. Everything's safe. Even like online rebellion, when, for good example, Jagex raising their prices to $15 a month a few weeks ago. Everything is just so corporate. You know, I don't even know. It just feels prepackaged. Even the rebellion, when people get mad about a subscription cost increase, sure, they get mad for a little while, then they just keep playing. And that's what the modern internet really pushes. They design stuff in such a way that even when you're mad, even when you're frustrated at certain aspects of something, you keep playing. Back in the day, the internet was just genuinely strange. You could tell there was real people behind everything. And honestly, when they talk about dead internet theory and how, the younger generations are nostalgic for a time that they weren't even born in, I think that's what people are starving for again. And that's why they're starving for that feeling again. You know, that's part of why nostalgia content works so well now. People miss imperfection because it feels human. That's why games like 2004 Scape are interesting to me. It's not just nostalgia bait for me. It truly is digital preservation. You know, Never would I have thought that I would have been able to revisit a version of this online culture that existed before modern internet that I grew up with. I figured, that was just lost to time. And, you when you come back to a game like this, you really do notice things immediately. The slower pacing, the silence, the simplicity, the emptiness. Modern online games just hate it. Old games embraced it. There are huge stretches of this game where just nothing happens. It takes forever with like a dragon longsword or a rune scimitar to get a level once you pass even like 70 combat. Everything was just so much slower. And now everybody's just filled with every information overload that you could think of, markers, notifications, battle passes, daily events. Everything in modern MMOs are just competing for your attention constantly. Excuse me. I just feel like old online games allowed you to just wander. And, that's what old school RuneScape captures a certain extent of, even still, is that it was a sandbox. You know, Wandering back then through a world like RuneScape 2 just created attachment for so many people. And I think that's something that the modern internet culture struggles with now. Everybody and everything just wants an immediate payoff in games like old school RuneScape and RuneScape 3. Immediate stimulation. They want immediate relevance. I get trashed all the time on old school RuneScape. People say that I bought my twisted bow because I don't have, such and such amount of kill count on a boss and everything like that. I mean, people are just so expectant now of you to follow a meta. They want that immediate relevance. But what I try to explain to people is that some of the most memorable gaming moments that I've ever had happened during times that were technically inefficient. Getting lost somewhere, talking to strangers, just wasting time. It's something we don't do anymore, but we did it because it was interesting back then. You know, Old MMOs were just so full of pointless experiences, and it really did make everything feel so much more human. You know, it's just wild. Back then, little things mattered so much more because the world felt socially real. You know, we would know each other in that game. People had reputations, and that followed you back in the early days when there wasn't as many people. And especially during the RuneScape Classic days before mini clip and the game just started exploding and stuff. You know, Community was really amazing to just live back then. The world just felt so real because everybody had some sort of reputation, and you would know people, you'd recognize them. And another thing is like just rare items. They felt mythical. I mean, party hats and stuff like that. Everything just felt so much different. A scammer could become infamous back then. You know, it wasn't like where you're just littered with scammers that are constantly trying to trade you and stuff. Those people were kids just like you and me were back then, and you recognized that person and that followed you. So it was just a very organic social fabric of gaming that was just so natural. It was messy, uncontrolled, and human. Honestly, I think people underestimate how lonely modern internet culture can feel. We're connected more than ever in my lifetime, but back then everything felt more connected because it was small, and it was just a lot warmer. Maybe because they required more effort back then. I don't know. Maybe because you kept seeing the same people, and maybe because the actual communication itself actually took a little more intention. Typing to somebody for 3 hours while fishing was just weirdly personal. You would remember that person as you played the game, sometimes even years down the road. And now it's just notifications and scrolling and, being as optimized as you can. Everything from RuneScape 2 back in the day lingered. Nothing today lingers. That's the word I keep coming back to. People stayed places. They stayed in conversations and they would develop an attachment to certain worlds, servers, because that would be your community. And I, I guess those places developed more of an atmosphere back then because people would stay. And I really think that atmosphere is disappearing from these modern online games and spaces and even social media. Everything is optimized for speed now. But, to have a certain level of atmosphere, you need that slowness. It needs the dead space where you just talk to people for hours, or you don't know what's, efficient, or you don't even care. It, you know, Gaming needs to return to allowing people to have awkwardness sometimes. Old internet was just so full of awkwardness. That's what made it memorable to me. And even the stuff that made you cringe back then, it just feels nostalgic looking back on it. Some of the horrible usernames, the edgy signatures people would have on their MSN accounts, over dramatic internet arguments. It all felt so real because nobody fully knew what they were doing. And maybe that's impossible to recreate now. Maybe this part of feeling is just tied to growing up and getting old and becoming a bitter old dude, a boomer, whatever. Uh, I don't know. I don't think it's only age. I genuinely think the structure of the internet changed. It used to just feel so much bigger, and now it just feels like just a glass wall controlled by a few algorithms. Everything is centralized now. And, I guess once things centralize, the culture does change. And discovery changes and the mystery just disappears. You know, you stop exploring when you have everything fed to you that you're actually seeking, and you just start consuming. And honestly, that's probably why so many people return to old games like 2004 Scape. Not because they literally want to relive childhood forever, but because they miss how online worlds like this used to feel. Slower, weirder, personal. Just alive, I guess. And even though projects like this, 2004 Scape can't fully recreate that era, they still preserve pieces of it. You know, this truly feels like I'm going back in a time machine and discovering an older part of the internet again. You know, it's that older culture, a time when logging into the game felt like stepping into a new adventure every time, as cliche as that sounds. I do miss that feeling. I think a lot of people do. I don't think it's just me. I don't think I'm alone in that. And maybe that's why these old worlds still matter and should be re explored for the future of internet development. I feel like returning to community would really go a long way to bring back that whole disconnect that so many people feel. But I don't know. It's just one of those things, I guess. Guess I'm just getting old, guys. But I guess I've ranted enough for one day. I've probably bored you guys to death. I really appreciate you guys that have subscribed so far. I've pretty much been walking around 2004 Skate begging some of you guys to subscribe just to kind of boost my numbers and try to get 50 so I could start streaming a little bit. It would be easier to play the game and just record video that way while I'm doing it live. But, I still like doing these kind of videos sometimes. The commentary is a little new to me, but hopefully we get this stuff figured out and I figure out a format that you guys really, really enjoy. But to all you guys that have subscribed when I asked you and actually kept that subscription, and even if you didn't, I really appreciate you guys taking a look at the channel. So I guess I'm done ranting for now. I just wanted to kind of reminisce and be old with you guys today. But yeah, hope you guys out there are enjoying 2004 Scape and hope I made you think a little bit today. And if I didn't, that's fine too. But you guys have a good day. And as always, thanks for watching. Have a blessed day. Dave Blunt's 2004 out. Peace.